चरण कमल गुर आशम दिया दुख सुख करत जन्म
Hello, welcome to the last lecture of this course, Introduction to the Sikhs. What I'd like to do today is wrap up in the sense of highlighting some of the main themes that we've explored in this course. But also I want to add some commentary and provide some perspectives which normally would not be in an introductory course, but I wanted to highlight them for those of you who are interested in exploring further. So I'd just start out by reviewing what I see as the core of the Sikh community and the Sikh tradition. And of course, it all revolves around Nanak, Guru Nanak to the Sikhs. Guru Nanak is quite a remarkable figure. He's somebody who is known throughout India and Pakistan as a major religious figure. And of course, his presence is vital to understanding the Sikh tradition. Indeed, all his 9 human successors signed everything they wrote with the name Nanak because they saw themselves and others saw them as carrying the spirit or literally the light or jyot of Guru Nanak. The other side of the Guru is of course the Sikh, the community of Sikhs, and as you call, Sikh means student or disciple, and this is of course the central pairing that defines the Sikh community. The Sikhs are of the Guru, and the Guru is of the Sikhs. One also sees the term Gursikh used, and I want to emphasize that Guru Nanak himself uses the term Sikh for his followers in his own writings. And then, of course, we have the Guru Granth Sahib, which is the central sacred text of the Sikhs. It's considered to be the living Guru. It embodies the teachings on the printed page, and now, of course, in digital form, it embodies imparts the teachings of the gurus to anybody who wants to learn from them. And as we mentioned earlier, it also includes writings of several religious figures from the period of the gurus and some slightly before, the Bhagats and the Sufis. A key part of the core, so I've talked about these components. A key idea, key conceptual core of the Sikh tradition is the notion of submerging the self. So connection to the divine involves overcoming home, this feeling of selfness, and the connection with the divine happens when one submerges the self in that larger consciousness. And of course, there's a strong emphasis on practice to achieve that, not just by meditation, but also by actions that embody service, what Sikhs call seva. There's also a very strong tradition among Sikhs of equality and justice. You can find this in the writings of Guru Nanak, and you can certainly see it embodied or represented in the lives of the gurus. Again and again, you see Sikhs and Sikh leaders standing up for the underdog. And the example of seva illustrates a broader principle of Sikh tradition, which is that of active engagement in this life. So achieving divine connection, submerging the self, is not meant to happen with complete detachment, without being part of the world. So if one is a student, one should be a student, a householder, and so on. There's no approval of being an ascetic and, say, begging for a living. Again, the emphasis is on earning an honest living and sharing with others. So this notion of engagement in the world, but still somehow not getting completely absorbed in it, is very central to Sikhism. Now I'll turn to a few nuances and debates in the Sikh tradition. And here I'm going to start touching on some scholarly works that have emerged in the last few decades, especially in Western academia, and offer some remarks on those. So what I've given is, I think, a very clear story of founding of the Sikh community by Guru Nanak, who collects his writings, appoints a successor, and founds a community of Sikhs in the town of community of Kartarpur, which is now in modern-day Pakistan, but in the region of Punjab. And so from that perspective, I think it's very clear that Nanak had something long-lasting in mind, and something that was defined as distinct. Guru Nanak, in his writings, says that he is offering something which is not in Hindu or Muslim sacred texts. The clarity in terms of founding sometimes is confused with definition, and one can certainly argue that the definition of who is a Sikh has, in terms of practices and so on, has evolved over time. But I think that does not mean that Sikhs did not have a sense of being a distinct community. And I think this is where some recent scholarship has completely gone astray. And a similar theme is that of continuity and change. I said that the definition of who is a Sikh has evolved. Some scholars, recent scholars, have borrowed Western concepts such as rupture and tried to apply that to the history of the Sikh community, particularly the impact of colonialism. I think there are certainly changes in as I said, in Sikh practice, in how the Sikhs conduct themselves, how they think of their relationship to society, and what they think of as appropriate practices. But I think in all of those changes, there's really a strong element of continuity. The core that I described on the previous slide, I think, really helps one to see that continuity. And even in the colonial period, when Sikhs were seeking to respond to the disruption created by British colonization, the natural instinct was to turn to the Guru Granth Sahib, the writings of Guru Nanak and his successors, for origins and continuity. We've talked about Guru Arjan and martyrdom. Guru Arjan was a very significant figure in Sikh history because he really, I think, his time as Guru marked in some ways a peak period for the Sikhs. They were very well settled, very prosperous, and attracting followers, and that is what led to the Mughal emperor ordering that he be stopped. Which led to his death in custody, essentially an execution. Again, some scholars have argued that Sikhs did not really understand this as a martyrdom at the time. I think subsequent scholarship has shown that Sikhs certainly understood Guru Arjan's the end of Guru Arjan's life as a sacrifice, and of course they would not have known that. Necessarily have known that the orders for what happened came from the Emperor Jahangir, but they certainly saw this as, again, very much in the Sikh spirit. Again, in a metaphorical sense, one can find the notion of sacrifice in the verses of Guru Nanak, and Guru Arjan therefore is embodying that idea of sacrifice in his own conduct. Another example where I think scholars have had sort of taken various revisionist positions is with respect to the Khalsa. Some scholars recently have treated the Khalsa as just another flavor of Sikh tradition. And I think for most Sikhs, even those who are not Amritdhari, not initiated in the Khalsa, for most Sikhs, I think that scholarly view is not accurate, and most Sikhs indeed have, I think, have an opinion of Guru Gobind Singh as playing a very significant role in Sikh history, and many scholars indeed have seen the Khalsa as again an embodiment of and progression of Guru Nanak's ideas of social justice and equality. And it's, of course, very easy to see that those concepts in the nature of the Khalsa. Again, there are there are nuances with respect to the genderedness of the Khalsa, where sometimes it has been very male-dominated, and perhaps the military aspect of it has been emphasized a lot. But again, if one looks at, I think, Sikh writings and Sikh perspectives, the Khalsa is much broader than that. It is very much not primarily a military community, but a spiritual community that is willing to stand up for in self-defense and also justice for all. So I think there's I think some Western scholarship that still needs to be revisited, and I think the position I've tried to take in this course is to provide overall actually a nuanced perspective that recognizes all the complications of the Sikh community, but nevertheless does not jettison what I think are the distinctive and central features of Sikh tradition. In all of this, I think where scholars have also tended to miss some aspects of Sikh tradition is the strong notion of autonomy, personal autonomy, but also respect for legitimate authority. And again, you see that in the connection between Guru and Sikh, the relationship between Guru and Sikh, and also in ideas like the Guru Panth, where the collective body of the Sikhs or the Khalsa is seen as representing the will of the Guru. Again, I think this contrasts with some scholars who have perhaps given too much weight to Sikh elites or the occasional Sikh ruler. And if you look at Sikh history and Sikh practice, I think there's really a much more decentralized democratic aspect to Sikh tradition, at the same time recognizing the primary authority of the spiritual teachings of the Gurus. Now I'd like to share a quote with you about knowledge and power. The exercise of power perpetually creates knowledge, and conversely, knowledge constantly induces effects of power. This is a very popular quote in Western academia. It comes from Michel Foucault, who is a very well-known, say, postmodernist, if one can use that term, French intellectual. The term here, postmodernism, refers to, I guess, the highlighting the importance of varying interpretations and subjectivities versus an approach which would focus just on a single objective reality. So I think if I were to modify this quote, I would actually put knowledge in inverted commas, because sometimes the so-called knowledge that is created by the exercise of power is not what I would argue is true knowledge. And here perhaps I'm then diverging from a hermeneutic or postmodernist view of how one can view reality. And I think certainly from the perspective of the Sikh community, the examples that I've given in the last slide are cases where the exercise of power within Western academia has created knowledge in inverted commas, which I do not think accurately reflects the Sikh community's own understanding of its history and its traditions. So I think turning to the Sikhs, why has that happened? I think a lot of it has to do with being a small community. Sikhs are a small community in India. They're a small community in the world as a whole, and in every place they've migrated to, they are a small community. So I think the minority status, I think, has an impact on the ability of the Sikhs to exercise power. The examples I gave in the last lecture of all the different websites, and there are many, many more, can be seen as examples of Sikhs trying to correct those imbalances of power using what is potentially a democratic medium, the internet, to get their case out there. But again, it's not an easy task. Power and culture. Here, what I'm really thinking of is the fact that Sikhs, in terms of their recognition as a community, are caught between, are sometimes overwhelmed or caught between larger cultures. In India, I think modern-day India, it's not just the culture that is associated with classical Hinduism and its modern manifestations in Hindu nationalism, but also in things like Bollywood, and then, of course, media culture more broadly. So I describe the internet as democratizing, but the internet can also be an overwhelming force, as we know, where everybody's being influenced by certain kinds of tweets or certain websites and so on. So I think for Sikhs, their preserving their culture and heritage has also been difficult, and it's another example of where I think Sikhs have been lacking relative power. A related example of this is the power of the state, and Sikhs as a minority in India, and before that as a minority during the Mughal Empire, have really felt the effects of being a relatively small group, and the exercise of state power can be quite devastating in Mughal Empire attempts to exterminate the community, in the attempts of the modern Indian state to crush what they saw as a separatist movement. The Sikh community has been at the receiving end of the overwhelming power of the state. And what I've alluded to, there's power in academia. I think there are actually relatively few Sikhs in Western academia, particularly in the humanities, and to some extent also in the social sciences. And I think this has influenced how the story of the Sikhs has been told in the last couple of decades in academia, where in my opinion, even Sikhs writing in Western academia have tended to bow down to the greater power of whoever can quote Foucault or Derrida and so on. So I know these are controversial issues, and I'm not in any way questioning academic freedom, but I think the inequalities of power in academia have to be recognized just as they have to be recognized in terms of the influence of media, culture, and the state. So having said all this, I think because Sikhs have evolved, the Sikh community has evolved in a situation where they've, for most of its history, has been subject to some kind of oppression or some kind of exercise of power by larger forces. I think Sikhs are in some ways very used to it. And what I think is interesting in Sikh history is that Sikhs have tended to, as I said, side with the underdog, whether it was Sikhs following Guru Har Gobind rather than Guru Arjan's uncle, who had state patronage and controlled Amritsar, the most central sacred site of the Sikhs, or Ram Rai, who was co-opted by Aurangzeb and then was replaced by his younger brother, who was just a child of 5. Or in the modern day, I think the Sikhs cooperated with the government to rebuild the Akal Takht after Operation Blue Star. They were completely rejected, and as I said, the mainstream Sikh community demolished it and built it again. So I think while one recognizes the effects of power on the Sikh community, I think there's a spirit of resistance and chardi kala, spirit of optimism in the context of the Sikhs. So a little more on situating the Sikhs. I've touched on many of these themes. Just very briefly to rephrase some of these ideas. I think it's very useful to think of Sikhs as an interstitial community, as somewhere between Hindus and Muslims, larger religious communities in South Asia. Again, I think scholars have tended to shy away from this recently. An older view was that Sikhism was somehow syncretic of Hinduism and Islam. That has been rejected, and certainly if you read Guru Nanak, he does not see what he's presenting as a syncretism in any way. He sees what he's teaching his followers as a new dispensation. But more recently, some scholars have questioned, in particular, whether the category Hindu made sense as a religious category at the time of the birth of the Sikh community. And I think there's actually evidence in the writings of the Sikh gurus and also of Bhai Gurdas, the scribe of the Guru Granth Sahib and relative of Guru Arjan, where the Sikhs are situated as not Hindu and not Muslim. So in those cases, Hindus are seen as a religious community. The features of that, I mean, Hinduism is very, very broad and somewhat fragmented. But the features of that description of what it means to be a Hindu, of course, are very much tied in with classical Hinduism, the caste system, the primacy of Brahmin priests, and so on. There's also, I think, some difficulties in terms of usage of the term Sikh. Some scholars have followed, again, Western academic fashions and said, well, Sikhism was not a religion, because religion is a post-Enlightenment Western term and is very heavily influenced by Christian tradition. On the other hand, I think one can very easily speak about Roman religion. So I think that narrowing of the term religion has been overdone. And even scholars like Talal Asad, who question the use of religion to describe Islam, don't really have a viable alternative. So one can accept the point that Asad makes, is that Islam, if one puts it in the category religion, is not the same as modern Christianity. But at the same time, I think one can recognize that there are features of all these traditions that can be characterized as religions. So I think one shouldn't shy away from thinking of the Sikhs as a religious community. At the same time, there's a very strong regional background since the Sikh tradition was born in Punjab and the language of Punjabi is very closely associated with the Sikh community. The term Punjabi for somebody from that region, of course, then is very appropriate. So Sikhs are almost all Punjabi or of Punjabi heritage, though one can argue about whether then one should extend that to ethnicity and say that they're of Punjabi ethnicity. That becomes, I think, more problematic in terms of trying to parse genetic differences. One can also have a broader regional idea of South Asian, but again, I think what I've argued, especially in the context of scholarship on Sikhs in California, terms such as South Asian and Punjabi tend to erase some of the distinctiveness of the Sikh community. Again, there's the notion of culture, and one can speak of cultural features of the Sikh community. And many of these will be Punjabi, but again, some of them might be considered to be Sikh without being common to all Punjabis. And culture, of course, is a very, very, very broad term. One can even perhaps think of religion and features of regional identity as making up part of culture. I've also mentioned ethnicity, and then slightly beyond ethnicity in terms of a category is that of race. Sikhs, I think, in most uses of the term are not a distinct race. One can, I think, argue that in the sense that there are African American converts to Sikhism and they're quite accepted. That doesn't mean that the concept is not unproblematic, and certainly race is very much a social construct, and how people are classified according to race can be misused in various ways. Earlier I talked about how Bhagat Singh Thind tried to get citizenship as a member of the so-called white race, and that was rejected, even though it fit in with fashionable racial classifications of the time. But then when it came up against realities of power, it was rejected. But race has interesting, it plays out in interesting ways. The term has been used for Sikhs in legal opinions in Britain, which allowed them to avail of some non-discriminatory provisions of the Race Relations Act of the 1960s in Britain, and 60s or 70s in Britain. And so, again, there one sees a difference between any kind of biological notion of race and the legal construct. Again, in terms of ethnicities, as I mentioned, Sikhs are now allowed to treat themselves as a separate ethnicity for purposes of the 2020 US Census. Again, this is a matter of trying to navigate what are sometimes arbitrary legal classifications, and in this case it was because religious categories are not allowed in the census. So one can explore these kinds of issues almost indefinitely, but again, what I want to emphasize is that it's very clear that Sikhs are a religious community, and again, they were essentially founded by Guru Nanak in the early 16th century. I think that is very easy to see. One doesn't have to overcomplicate it. Politics and religion is another interesting issue for Sikhs. The Sikh community was willing to stay aloof from political rulers till the martyrdom of Guru Arjan, and after that Guru Hargobind, his son and successor, chose to exert temporal and religious authority, basically with the argument that the temporal ruler of the time, the Mughal emperor, and the local Mughal authorities had abdicated their responsibility to be just rulers. And this one can find again in the teachings of Guru Nanak, where he's very critical of corrupt and unjust rulers. So this is a thread that has then stayed through Sikh experience and tradition. And again, one finds it in modern-day India, where Sikhs are not averse to expressing their unhappiness with corrupt or unjust politicians. There, I think, also some interesting issues about how these attitudes compare with Islam and with European Christianity or United States Christianity and so on. And sometimes I think the boundaries between politics and religion are overstated in Western contexts. So I think it's fair to say that Sikhs are not that unusual in terms of being willing to accept connections between politics and religion. Again, there are broader issues, especially in the Indian context of state society and secularism. I'll just briefly say that India has been was conceived of as a secular nation, not in the French sense of separating, or Western European sense of separating church and state completely, but in terms of not favoring any religion. And indeed, what's interesting is that the framers of the U.S. Constitution, I think, had more of that kind of secularism in mind, not being anti-religious, but just not wanting to have an established church. The primary example of that would be the Church of England, which the American revolutionists were escaping from. But there's also for example, the authority of the French Catholic Church, which led to the French approach to secularism. So I think there are, again, complicated issues here in terms of the role of the state, secularism in civil society, and so on, broader than just politics and religion. And what I would suggest is that actually Sikhs are not averse to navigating these complications without taking extreme positions in either direction. So a little more on clearing conceptual thickets, again, getting into some scholarly detail. I'll try and be relatively brief here. The term Bhagat is very well used in Indian history by historians of India. In Hindi, the people are Bhakts, and the term is Bhakti, and this refers to personal devotion. This was a very broad-based and heterogeneous movement in India in the 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th centuries. Many scholars, many historians are very comfortable putting Nanak into this bhakti tradition, and it's certainly possible to do that because of the breadth of the term bhakti. Though I want to emphasize that Nanak himself did not see himself as following any of the Bhagats. He does not quote the Bhagats. He does not put their writings into his collection. It's only with Guru Amar Das, who came from a Vaishnava Bhakti background, who incorporated writings of some of the Bhagats. At the same time, the Gurus were very clear about making the teachings of the Gurus primary and the verses of the Bhagats as supporting material in some sense. All of this is very important because in the last few decades, Western academics have propagated a term Sant, by which they mean Nirgun Bhagats who were not followers of any of the avatars of Vishnu like Ram or Krishna, but were instead Nirgun, just followers of the divine in the formless manner. I think this is a complete misreading of history. The term Sant comes into usage for collection of Nirgun Bhagats only in the late 19th, early 20th century, and it's actually propagated by Hindu ideologues. And so applying the term Sant there's, I think, a problem of using the term Sant for a collective, and there's an even bigger problem in terms of applying the term Sant to Guru Nanak. And unfortunately, Western scholars have continued to propagate what I think is a major historical error. Similarly, with the Singh Sabha, some recent scholars have tried to tell a story of the Singh Sabha, which is a sort of good guys and bad guys story where some extremists imposed a narrow view of Sikh tradition on the community. I think, again, this is a total misreading of Sikh history. If you look at the period, the colonial period, and the evolution of the Singh Sabhas and the Akali movement after that, there's a lot more debate, there's a lot more fragmentation. The groups that are promoting what is now, some scholars are arguing, is a more inclusive version of Sikhism were actually groups that had a lot of followers that were not followers of the entire Sikh tradition. They were basically mostly Hindu in their practices. So I think this is an area that still needs, where the revisionist history actually needs to be re-revised and corrected. If you look at the Sikh community today, again, you'll see a lot of diversity. You'll see a lot of debate. And even though there's been some attempts to standardize and create a common core, the discussions over practices go on. I think, again, there's a confusion in these debates between diversity and distinctiveness. So one can have a community that is diverse in many respects, but still distinctive. For any community, there's going to be fuzziness around the boundaries, and one can see this in Christianity, Islam, Judaism, where there's more or less adherence to a certain set of practices. So I think, again, the Sikhs have been not well served by a lack of representation in academia and being a relatively small minority in many different venues. Again, some of this revisionist history focuses on colonialism, and some scholars have even suggested that modern Sikh identity is almost wholly a product of the British encouraging what was just a small facet of Sikhism. Again, if one looks at Sikh history, particularly the history of the Sikhs just after the founding of the Khalsa and through the 18th century, one can see that this is a very this is not an accurate view of history. The idea of a colonial rupture, while it fits very well with modern humanities tropes of post-colonial studies, I think really does injustice to the Sikhs. There are different events that affect Sikh history, the martyrdom of Guru Arjan, the founding of the Khalsa, and the conquest by the British, as well as independence and post-independence India. But these are all, I think, they are not, to my mind, they don't come to the level of being ruptures. They are certainly shocks to the community, but there's, again, I would emphasize a high degree of continuity in how the community views itself. There's also discussions of Orientalism and postmodernism. Orientalism representing a sort of colonial perspective on the exotic Easterner, and postmodernism, as I said, representing an emphasis on subjectivities and interpret things how you want. I think both of these actually methodologies, if I can call them that, have infected Sikh studies to the detriment of understanding the Sikh community. Certainly, I think postmodernism helps us to see the subjective biases of Orientalist accounts of non-Western societies, but I think it's possible to find Orientalist perspectives even in postmodern writers in Western academia. So I think these are very complicated epistemological issues that deserve more investigation. Again, I should say that the Sikh community has felt somewhat powerless, and sometimes they've responded to what they see as misrepresentations of their experience in academia, in Western academia by being very strident, and that has in fact produced a very defensive reaction from academics. I think it's possible to have a much more inclusive and empathetic approach to writing about the Sikh community, while still recognizing the possibility of diverse perspectives and diverse interpretations. Again, I think the dichotomy between modernity and tradition has been overstated for the Sikhs, but it's interesting how Sikhs do navigate this in a very specific way. In particular, the Khalsa tradition seems to be very out of step with modernity, and again, many Sikhs find it an irksome discipline. There's even a colloquial reference to Sikhs who give up the Khalsa identity or give up keeping long hair as quote, modern Sikhs. So this goes back to some of the discussion I was providing earlier about the influence of culture, and certainly to the extent that modern media shape ideals of beauty or looks and so on, they have an impact. Again, I think for many Sikhs, the feeling is that one can keep the best of both. One can adapt to the modern and also keep what is important in the traditional. And for these Sikhs, the teachings of the Gurus from Guru Nanak through Guru Gobind Singh are important parts of the tradition. Interestingly, one can see this approach in the Singh Sabha discussions of over a century ago, where they tried to balance modernity and tradition, if I can put it in those simple terms. Again, there's a lot of aspects of specific beliefs and practices that I haven't gone into in this introductory course. There's a lot of details of ceremonies, of theological perspectives in particular that one can parse almost endlessly. For example, Sikhs have argued over whether Sikhism is monotheistic or monistic, or now the latest term I've seen applied to Sikh beliefs about the divine is panentheistic. And each of these terms themselves, once you try to define it, I think it runs into problems. And perhaps it's just illustrative of the view that the divine is undefinable. Similarly, there's often a focus on variations in practice, things like turban tying styles or colors of clothing, styles of clothing. But I think where scholars go wrong is trying to then extrapolate those into arguing that the Sikh community does not have a definition, it does not have a core. And that's where I think a lot of what I've seen as recent Western scholarship has struggled. And a lot of it is because actually many of the scholars writing on the Sikhs themselves do not have the facility with language and the ability to read Sikh traditional texts or even read modern Sikh writers in Punjabi. So just to start wrapping up finally, I think the story of the Sikhs is a story of agency and action. Scholars have tended to give too much weight to leadership, but certainly the Gurus have been important in Sikh history, but one can see again and again that it's the community itself that understands it has a great deal of agency. And I think this in particular is a welcome antidote to the belief that somehow Singh Sabha elites created Sikhism as we know it today. Again, I think I've spent a lot of time on history, and history is important to the Sikhs, but there's a lot more, I think, that can be done in terms of understanding Sikhs in the present day, both in India and in a variety of locations now that where they weren't in the past. Seeing how the Sikh community evolves from this present, I think, will be very interesting. And of course, the community is only 500 years old, so it has hopefully a long future ahead of it. So I'm going to conclude with the ending of the Sikh prayer. It goes Nanak Naam Chardi Kala. Nanak, through the name, the divine, one will stay in uplifted spirits. And Tere Pane Sarbat Tapala. Tere Pane, from with your blessing, with your grace that's addressing the divine, the welfare of all will be achieved. So again, this, I think, just this couplet itself captures what I think is a lot of the common core of Sikh beliefs and Sikh practices. So I thought I'll pretty much end with that. And I'll end, of course, with a Sikh greeting. So thank you, Sat Sri Akal, and as some other Sikhs would prefer, Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh.